Hello there and welcome to the second in our series of webinars looking at the life cycle of a charity. Thank you all for joining us today. These webinars are supported by charity investment experts Rathbones, and their support enables us to run these regular webinars. So as I said, this is the second in our series, and last month's was all about setting up a charity. And we did a recording of that, so that can be found on the SCVO website. And today we're looking at what you need to know to run your charity on a day-to-day basis. Just to know that this webinar is also being recorded and will be available later. And we've also got the captioning facility enabled today, so I'm not sure how that's going to cope with my accent. But if you'd rather not see that, then my colleague Joanne will put instructions into the chat so that you can turn that off. So my name is Tracy Bird, and I run the SCVO Information Service, along with my colleague Rhonda McLean, who's here today, and also Christy McAlpine, who heads up our Funding Scotland service. We've also got Lorna Robertson with us from SCVO, and she's going to tell you all about our HR and employment support service and the things that you should think about when you're thinking about taking on staff. Christina Hines from the Edinburgh Voluntary Organisations Council is here, and she helps people set up and run charities just like Rhonda and I. And I'll outline the ways that TSIs can help you run your, will outline the ways that TSIs can help you run your charity. We've also got with us Leanne Lodge, and she's head of charities with Gillespie McAndrew, and they're one of our partners in SCVO's free legal advice service. And that gives members up to 2 hours of free legal advice. And that covers all manner of topics, including governance, property, and HR. And then last but not least, we have with us today Steve Kent from Oscar. And he's got loads and loads of experience in the sector. And he's going to look at trustee duties and decision-making and fundraising, annual reporting, and more. So do use the chat box as we go to ask questions, because we've left time at the end. And I hope you'll make the most of all the knowledge and experience we've got with us today. So just to start us off, I'm going to quickly run through how SCVO can help you with the day-to-day running of your charity. Oh, and I forgot to mention, we will send out all of the slides after today, so you don't have to frantically take notes as we go. So here goes with my slides. So, right, okay. So the day-to-day running of a charity. So how can SCVO help? Well, as I said, we have an information service. That's the website address, and you can contact us in a variety of ways, by email, by telephone. We also, as I've mentioned, have a pro bono legal and tax advice service for our members. And we can also offer one-to-one support for members. So we've got a mechanism on the website where you can just book that up with either Rhonda or myself to either help you with constitutions, setting up, governance, your board, data protection, lots of different things. So do check that out if you think that would help. And we're also producing model policies and templates, and we've got quite the list there. But if you think there's anything missing that we could provide, do let us know. So as I said, that's what we can help you with. The website's set up in 2 distinct sections, setting up and running. And under running, there are lots of information on governance as well. So that's what the running your organization section looks like. And these are the things that we cover within that: business planning, legislation and regulation, and a whole list there that you can see. We've also got a special page on the running cost crisis. And much like our coronavirus hub, we've responded to the cost of living crisis by collecting all the information and support in one place. So go to that. You'll see on there's a little yellow button, get in touch, because we're really keen to hear from you on the challenges that you're facing and what we can do to help there. We have a training department, and this offers half-day, full-day training, mainly online, but we can come out to organisations to do face-to-face training, or online as well on different topics. So if you go to our training pages, there's something we're not covering there, do get in touch and we'll see how we can help. We have, as I say, we run webinars in the past that we always record, and we have a YouTube channel, and on there you'll find topics such as cyber resilience, flexible working, business planning, evaluation. So do check that out, because also trustee roles and responsibilities, because that's quite useful, I think. We have a Scope e-learning platform on our website, and that covers governance, finance, fundraising, communications and risk management. And I think it's a great induction tool if you've got new trustees, or even a refresher for people that have been there a while. And the beauty of e-learning, I suppose, is that it offers learning at a time and a place that suits you. We have digital experts at SCVO, and they can provide lots of different kinds of help. We've got how-to guides. Again, you can book one-to-one support. There's a digital checkup, so you can see where you are in your journey with digital, where you would need extra support, training and events. So I would encourage you to check that out as well. Funding Scotland, I mentioned before, and there is a wealth of information on there. You can search that either on the kind of things you're looking for funding for, the area you're based in, that kind of thing. And, you know, get in touch with my colleague Christy at the Funding Scotland email address if you want some extra help with that. And then finally, for me, we have an HR and employment support service, and that's free to anyone to use. So I would encourage you to check that out. But Lorna's going to tell you more about that because she's the expert. So that's it from me. As I say, put your questions in the chat box as we go, and we'll have a good discussion at the end. Thank you. Over to you, Lorna.
Thank you, Tracy. And thank you very much for inviting me along today to speak. My name is Lorna Robertson. I coordinate the HR service within SCVO. So to give you a very quick overview of the service, we help any and all voluntary organisations with your HR queries, questions. You can get in contact with us. I'm going to just share my slides in just a second and you'll see our email address. You can also access that through our website and then complete an inquiry form to get in touch with us. And you can talk to us about any and all people queries, issues, problems, and we can have a chat about it. Just give me a second while I share my screen and I will take you through what I'm going to be talking about, which is the top 10 things to think about when taking on staff. Now, some of you might already be really experienced in taking on staff and others may not have ever done it. So I just wanted to take you through my top 10 tips within the 10 minutes that I have. So let's get started. You'll see there just before I get started the email address, so you can get in contact with me anytime if we don't cover a question that you have today. So number one, is there a clear need to hire? So you've decided that you want to hire someone into the organisation. Why? What is the need for that? Is there a clear business case, and is there an idea of what their title will be and what their responsibilities are? If you're applying for funding, these details will need to be included in the application, for example, the job description. You might also want to think about the Fair Work principles. I can add a link to the Fair Work Convention website onto the chat later on. Number two, do you need an employee, a worker, or a contractor? So employment contracts can take on different forms depending on the different kind of role that you're hiring for and the kind of working relationship that you want to have with them. The different types of contract also inform what kind of rights they will have. For example, a freelancer or a contractor doesn't have any right to annual or sick leave, and they have full responsibility over their own tax and national insurance payments. An employee, however, has a day one right to these things, and their pay slips will include tax and national insurance already deducted. A worker is slightly different. where their arrangements are either casual or 0 hours based, and they aren't usually entitled to things like flexible working arrangements, statutory redundancy pay, or protection against unfair dismissal, although that doesn't include discrimination. Things to consider with deciding what kind of contract that you want to offer. So for example, if the job is to deliver a short-term project and it requires specific expertise that you might not already have on staff, a freelance contractor could be a good option there. This means that you don't have responsibility for tax and national insurance and no employer responsibilities. If you've secured funding for a 2-year period and there's a more long-term, or if there's a chance that it might go on for longer, employing someone on either a fixed term contract or a permanent basis is also an appropriate option. Or you might operate a playgroup or a community after school care and only require people during term time. In this case, you might employ a worker on a casual basis or term time basis. Number 3, how much is all going to cost? So depending on the type of contract that you want to pursue, there are costs to consider. For an employer, you would need employer's liability insurance, considering the salary, making also considerations to the living wage and living hours. And you can visit the Living Wage Scotland website to tell you more information on that. National insurance contributions and pension contributions should be considered, and also the costs included with holiday pay and sick pay. And then there's your recruitment costs. So how much is it going to cost to advertise for the role? The labour that it costs to sift through your candidates and interview, which then leads me on to writing the job description. So write the job description with your existing staff, and co-creation is good. So it makes sense to create a job description with the people who will be working alongside the new recruit. They might know things about the team dynamics or needs of the team that you don't, and they might also have some great ideas that haven't been considered. It's also really important to be clear on what the responsibilities of the role are going to be and what their remit is. Then you need to consider if what you've written can actually be achieved in reality. So within their working hours, can it be achieved? Is it reasonable? Then it's time to advertise. And don't forget to be inclusive. So things to consider here are where to advertise, and what really do I mean by being inclusive with advertising for a role. So the essential desirable criteria thing. You might have someone that has a look through the advert and then you've said the essential criteria is a degree and 10 years experience in a specific field. They're like, well, I don't have any of that, so I'm not going to apply. But actually, they could be really great for your organisation and a great fit. So things to consider there are, is a degree or is that years of experience really necessary to do the job? Are you offering alternative arrangements for interviewing or for the application, which I'll go on to in more detail in just a moment? And are you recruiting blindly? What is your recruitment process? Are you seeing everyone's personal details, which allows for things like unconscious bias to creep in? Or are you doing it without any identifying details involved? Number 6, who is going to interview the candidates, and are you still being inclusive? So who is the best person in your organisation or people to interview the candidates? Do you have good questions prepared? Where are the interviews taking place? If they're in person, have you thought through about whether in-person interviews are necessary? So is it a hybrid or a remote role, but you want everyone to interview in person? Is that necessary? And then what do I mean by inclusivity when interviewing? So is the location accessible if it's in person? If the role, as I've said, is advertised as hybrid or remote, does the interview need to be conducted in person or can it be done on Zoom? And between 15 and 20% of the population are neurodiverse. So things like allowing notes into the interview, providing interview questions beforehand, and inviting candidates for a tour around the building before the interview to put everyone at ease might make the experience easier for people. So it's thinking a little bit outside of the box as to your approach for recruitment to essentially attract the widest candidate pool you can. So once you've got past that stage, you've then hired someone. What do you need to have prepared before their first day? So this is where contracts come into play and policies and their induction plans. So have you got the right contract all set up for them to sign and have a look over on their first day? Do you have employment policies in place that will complement what is in the contract? Do they have the right to work? It's one of the first things that they need to provide and prove with a document to show that they have the right to work in the UK. And then finally, their induction plan. So what will they be doing on their first day? So consistency here is key. It has to be a really good experience from the first day. Are they working from home? So how do you plan to help them settle in remotely? What information do they need to know on day one? This could include things like health and safety measures, the equipment that they'll be using, how to use that equipment, any kind of key logistics about their day-to-day that they need to know, all the basics. Number 9, what is the plan for their first 6 months? So they're not just going to be learning on that day one. Induction is not just about their first day. Have you got an extended induction plan agreed with their line manager? And does the new recruit have some objectives to work towards? Recruitment and retention is really challenging at the moment. So it's really more important than ever to make sure that new recruits have a good experience and that you're involving them in that throughout the first 6 months as well, so that you know how things are going from their perspective as well as yours. And then finally, what did you learn from the recruitment experience? If this is your first time recruiting, look back on that experience. How did things go? What went well? What didn't go well? What if you had done things differently? What if you had taken this approach instead? And then that can inform your future experiences of recruiting into the organisation. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lorna. That was great. If anybody is thinking of taking on staff, or you've got any specific questions, as Lorna said, you can either put them in the chat or get in touch with her via the email address that she gave. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Steve Kent from Oscar, and I'll just give him a few minutes to set up his slides. So take it away, Steve.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and thank you again. Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you this afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me just, if I can get. There we are. Everybody see that? All right. Okay. Well, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Kent. I'm a policy manager in Oscar's policy and sector improvement team. And my job this afternoon is to talk to you about charity trustees and about the responsibilities excuse me, and the duties that charity trustees have and what Oscar expects of you. And I'm saying you in appreciation that I do, I realise that not everybody I'm speaking to this afternoon is a charity trustee. But before I do that, I want to touch briefly upon what we mean by a charity trustee, because it's a term that we still find causes some confusion for some charities. Every charity has trustees, and they are the people that Oscar holds accountable for what a charity does. But they may not be called charity. In your charity, they may be called something different. According to the law, charity trustees are the persons having the general control and management of the administration of a charity. So in simple terms, that means the people who are in charge. And it's a definition of role and function rather than of title. Your charity's governing document, its constitution, may refer to the trustees collectively as the board or the management committee. Sometimes the people on this committee are called directors or governors, or just simply referred to as the committee members. But in all likelihood, if you set up meetings of the most senior decision-making body in a charity, and if called upon to do so, you would be entitled to vote at those meetings, then you are a charity trustee. And your charity's constitution will most likely have rules about charity trustees, for example, how they're appointed, how many of them there should be, how long they serve for, and so on. And those rules are there for good reason, to ensure that the charity is well managed. So your first duty as a charity trustee is to make sure that you're familiar with those rules and that you abide by them. Commonly, charity trustees are chosen by the members of a charity. They're either elected at a general meeting, for example. They may be appointed by the other trustees or co-opted to fill vacant positions. In some cases, people may be trustees by virtue of a particular job they have, such as a church minister or a school head teacher, what are known as ex officio trustees. Or trustees may be appointed as representatives of some outside interest groups. Something we are often asked is whether anyone can be a charity trustee, and the answer is generally yes, but there are some people who are disqualified in law from being a trustee if they have certain criminal convictions, for example. And something to be aware of, particularly at the moment in the current economic situation, is that people who are declared as bankrupt or who have entered into trust deeds with their creditors are also disqualified until they are discharged from their obligations. And we're in the current situation where many people are struggling with their personal finances. That's just something to bear in mind. Remember also that your charity's constitution may include rules about who is allowed to be a trustee, and you must ensure that you're familiar with those rules and that you do not appoint anyone who is not eligible. But however you get to be a trustee, it's important to remember that once you are appointed, you are all equal in importance and authority. Individual trustees may be appointed or assigned to particular roles in a charity, like a secretary or a treasurer, with an expectation that they carry out certain duties associated with that role. But ultimately, the trustees share responsibility and work together as a team for the good of the charity as a whole, which leads me on quite neatly to my next slide. Charity law sets out a number of general duties that apply to all charity trustees, and some specific duties, which I'll come back to a bit later on. Firstly, you must always ensure that you act and take decisions in what you believe to be the interests of the charity. And this must take precedence over other things, including any personal interests of your own, or the interests of any other body or organisation that you have connections to, including anybody that appointed you as a charity trustee. If anything prevents you or compromises your ability to take objective decisions in the interests of a charity, it's what we would refer to as a conflict of interests. And conflicts of interest may arise in all kinds of ways. For example, if you run a local business that could offer services to the charity, you may find it hard to set aside your interests in that business when deciding whether the charity should enter into a contract with it. But not all dual interests will necessarily be in conflict. For example, if you're a trustee of several local charities that work together, it may be advantageous to both charities to have a trustee in common, provided that you don't favour one over the other. Your charity's constitution may have rules about what you should do when a conflict of interest arises, or you may have a separate policy about it. The important thing is that you're open and honest about it with the other trustees. In other words, that you declare your interest. It's then for the other trustees to decide what to do about it. Typically, you may have to withdraw from certain decisions, but we would not normally expect you to resign as a trustee. One particular instance where a conflict of interest may arise concerns payments to trustees, what the law refers to as remuneration. The law does not entirely rule out charity trustees from being paid for their services to a charity, but it does attach strict conditions to it. And you should make sure that you're familiar with these conditions if you're considering payments or other benefits of any kind to your trustees. And bear in mind, of course, that your charity's constitution may disallow the remuneration entirely. Secondly, you must make sure that everything the charity does is in keeping with its charitable purposes. In other words, the reasons why the charity was created. The purposes will be described usually in fairly broad terms in the charity's constitution. They don't usually go into a lot of detail about what the charity does, but they do explain why it does those things. For example, your charity may have a team of volunteers that make home visits to older people in the local area. The home visiting service is an activity, not a purpose. The reason why the charity runs that service is to relieve the needs of people who are lonely and isolated. The charity could perhaps relieve those needs in other ways, such as running a day centre, but the purpose, the relief of need, would remain the same. And this distinction between activities and purposes is important because the activities of a charity are likely to change over time as circumstances change, but the purposes remain fixed in the Constitution. Events of the past few years have made this especially important. Many charities have had to adapt the ways they've worked because of lockdown restrictions, but they have remained true to their charitable purposes. So there are really two essential points to take from this. First, as a trustee, you should make sure that you are familiar with your charity's stated purposes in its constitution. And second, whenever considering a new or a changed activity, you should always ask, is this in keeping with our charitable purposes, and how will it help us to achieve them? If you find over time that your charity's purposes are in need of updating, it may be possible to amend them, and the rules for changing them may be contained in the Constitution itself, or depending upon the legal form of the charity, there may be provision in law to allow for it. But if you do wish to change them, you will need OSCA's consent beforehand, and I'll say a wee bit more about that in just a minute. Thirdly, charity trustees must exercise a reasonable level of care and diligence when managing the affairs of the charity. And it's worth just reflecting here for a moment on the word trustee, because it means a person on the receiving end of someone else's trust. You have been trusted to look after the money or the property donated by other people with a view to ensuring that it is used for the purposes that they had intended. But what does reasonable mean here? What the law says is that you must act with the care and diligence that it is reasonable to expect of a person who is managing the affairs of another person. In other words, if you were looking after somebody else's property, or perhaps keeping an eye on their business while they're away, the assumption is that you're more likely to be, you're likely to be more careful with it than you were if it were your own property. Charity trustees often have complex decisions to make, decisions that involve a degree of risk or that are beyond their personal knowledge or experience. The reasonableness test does not expect you to be an expert in such matters, but it does expect you to take and act upon the advice who you believe have that expertise. And it expects you to discuss and agree such matters together collectively as a team after careful consideration of all of the information available to you. If individual trustees are delegated to carry out certain tasks, this should be properly recorded so that the extent of and the limits to their authority are understood by all. And they must report back to the others, because ultimately all of the trustees share the responsibility for what is done. And acting with reasonable care also expects you to be aware of the world around you and around the charity, and to plan ahead. What are the potential risks your charity might face and how should you safeguard against them? For example, what kind of reserve funds should the charity aim to keep in order to meet its obligations in case of difficult times in future? And thinking ahead also includes planning for your own succession. Who will be the trustees to follow after you? When the time comes for you to step down as a trustee, how can the affairs of the charity be passed into their safekeeping? If there is one word that sums up the role that charity trustees have, it is governance. But what does governance mean? Because charities vary so much in size and nature, coming up with a simple definition is not easy. After all, the role of trustees is likely to be very different in a charity that is run entirely by volunteers than it would be in one that employs a team of staff and managers. But governance doesn't quite mean the same thing as management, at least not the sort of operational management that goes on from day to day in a charity. It has a longer term, wider and more strategic dimension to it. To use a simple analogy, governance concerns itself less with the individual trees and more with the forest as a whole, which is not to say that the individual trees are unimportant, far from it. It's just that you're unlikely to spend time at trustee meetings considering them. So governance is best thought of in terms of its functions rather than precisely how it will be practiced in any given charity. The governance code developed by Scotland's Third Sector Governance Forum has identified 5 key components of effective governance, which are produced here on this slide. So ensuring that the charity remains true to its purpose and values, providing effective leadership and strategic direction for the charity, ensuring that the charity conducts itself in an honest, open, transparent and accountable manner, and ensuring that the charity has appropriate controls in place to protect and use its assets, its resources. And this will include things like financial controls such as budget setting, record keeping, keeping track of income and expenditure. But it may also include things like ensuring that there are proper procedures for staff recruitment, supervision and training, keeping property and equipment in good state of repair and so on. And finally, ensuring that the charity is effective and making a positive difference. So an important part of governance is about monitoring progress and evaluating the impact that the charity is having. Charity trustees should ask themselves, what will success look like and how should we be measuring it? And it really can't be stressed enough that charity trustees are at their most effective when they work together as a team without dominant individuals or reluctant hangers-on who, for whatever reason, are unable or willing to play their full part. And teamwork, let's face it, teamwork takes some effort. It requires people to make a commitment to work together constructively for the good of the charity as a whole, including sometimes putting to one side any personal differences or allegiances that you may have. Many charity committees find benefit in going through some training together to explore how they can best work with each other. And bear in mind that teams don't always agree with each other. Debate and discussion are important parts of finding solutions. Even voting may be necessary at times. But while healthily expressed disagreement is an important step on the way to reaching a decision, open dissent and dispute rarely are. And I believe at a later event in this Lifecycle series, we will be looking in more depth about why relationships in charities sometimes break down and what happens and what results when they do. I said earlier that trustees also have some specific duties when it comes to reporting to OSCR. Some of these reporting duties happen routinely each year, while others will only be triggered if particular events or circumstances arise. It is essential that OSCR is able to maintain contact with all charities. Therefore, if there is any change to the contact details for your charity, you must let us know as soon as possible. And the simplest way to do that is by logging on to Oscar Online and updating the details. If you are stepping down as the principal contact, remember to pass on the login details and passwords to whoever is replacing you. All charities are required to complete an online annual return and to send us annual accounts. And these are due within 9 months of the end of your charity's financial year, so it's accounting reference date. Information in the annual return helps us to keep the Scottish Charity Register up to date. And the amount of information you have to provide will depend upon the size of the charity measured by its income. Larger charities, those with an income of over £25,000 a year, will have to provide more information. The types of accounts you have to prepare will also depend upon the legal form of the charity, its size, and any rules in the constitution or decisions that the members have taken. But all accounts must include not only financial information, but also a narrative report by the trustees on the activities of their charity over the preceding year. And they must have been examined or audited by somebody independent of the charity. Back in 2016, we introduced a new procedure through which charities could notify us about serious incidents that might have an impact on their charity or its assets. For example, your charity may have experienced or be faced with significant loss of funding. It may have been subject to criminal investigation or inquiry by another regulator, or been the subject of fraud or theft, or have been involved with incidents of abuse or mistreatment of vulnerable beneficiaries. There is detailed guidance on our website about how to report these matters to us, what we refer to as notifiable events. And our principal interest here will be in what the charity trustees are doing to address the concern. What are the lessons they have learned from it, and what actions are they taking, and whether they're cooperating with other investigating authorities and so forth. In some cases, that may lead to us opening an inquiry into the charity. And finally, as I said earlier, there are some actions that your charity can only take if it has consent from Oscar beforehand. For example, if you wish to change the legal name of your charity or to make amendments to its charitable purposes in the Constitution, then you must notify us at least 6 weeks before you plan to make the change, and only proceed if we grant consent. Other changes to the Constitution don't need our consent, but you must still notify us that you have made them and provide us with an updated copy of the Constitution as soon as possible. And if all this sounds rather daunting, then please don't despair. There's plenty of guidance available to assist you, both from Oscar and from other sources. There's just a few of them listed here as examples on this slide. The first is our own guidance for good practice for charity trustees. The second is our Who's in Charge guidance, which was based upon particular case studies we did where there were concerns about who was running a charity. I think we're going to add links to some of these in through this chat function during the course of the event. But if you have any doubts, you can call or email us through the links on our website, and we will either offer you assistance or we will direct you to someone else who can help. And finally, you can keep up to date by signing up to our regular news bulletin, Oscar Reporter, or by following us on various social media platforms by following any of the links on this page. And I think that's me done. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. That was great. I'm going to hand over to Christina next, but just while she's getting set up, there is a question for you, Steve, from Frank Drummond, and he's asking if you're reviewing or redefining your charitable purposes. Do you have to include the exact wording of one or more of the various purposes as defined in the Act, or merely specify purposes which can be recognised as being in line?
No, you certainly don't have to replicate the wording exactly as in the Act. In fact, in many ways, it's probably best if you don't, because the important thing is that it's expressed in your own language, if you like, in your own words. From our point of view, the important thing is that we must be able to see a clear link between your written statement of purposes and one of the purposes in the Act. So sometimes we find that charities will go a kind of halfway house, if you like. So they will say something like, the purpose of our charity is to advance education by ... So they will kind of personalize it, if you like, to their charity. We can then quite clearly see how that purpose relates to one of the defined purposes in the legislation. But the ones which are often quite difficult for us to really get a handle on what a charity's planning to do is where it simply says the purpose of our charity is to advance education, which is clearly charitable in law, but it doesn't really give us much of a clue to go on when we're assessing an application to amend a purpose. So by all means refer to the purposes in the Act, but you don't have to adhere to them slavishly.
Thanks, Steve. And there's also a link that Paul has put in there on more advice, and you can see worked up purposes within that advice as well. Okay, thank you. Christina, over to you, and you can tell us all about third sector interfaces.
Thank you. I've just got a few slides to share, so I'll get those up. So my name's Christina and I work for EVOC, which is the Edinburgh Voluntary Organisations Council, and we're part of the Edinburgh TSI. So I just want to take a few minutes to explain what a TSI is and what they've got to do with your organisation's life cycle. So TSI stands for Third Sector Interface, and the TSIs are a network of local support organisations. So there's a TSI for every local authority. But you're more likely to know them by the name of the organisation that's in your area. So if you're in Edinburgh, you might know EVOC, in Glasgow, GCDS, in Dundee Voluntary Action. I'm not going to go through all 32, don't worry. And TSIs work locally. So our remit is to support the community organisations that are in our area. And that can be sports clubs, peer support groups, mental health or disability organisations, and it can be any type of organisation also. So whether that's a newly forming group, a constituted group, or a long-established charity. So what do we help with? So TSIs offer support at each stage of an organization's development, and that's often when people will come to us with questions or where they need extra help, is when they kind of reach a new stage in their life cycle. So as an example, you might have a group of people that want to address littering in their community. So they form a group to tackle that. And then they might find that they need some funding to buy litter pickers, gloves, things like that. And so they need a constitution and a bank account. And then after a while, that group might find that as they're bringing people in the community together, they come up with more ideas about other activities that they want to do. And so they want to employ somebody to coordinate those activities. And at that stage, maybe they'll want to become a SKIO. And so these are all things that a TSI can help with. The forming, writing a constitution, opening a bank account, each of those processes. And then for charities that have been around for a long time, you might need help with things like changing from a charitable company to a SKIO, maybe re-engaging with your members, or looking at ways to recruit new board members. And again, these are all things that your TSI can offer support with. So TSIs can offer training and one-to-one supports, and that training might be training that's open to any organization to come along to, or it can sometimes be bespoke training for boards also. And then in terms of the one-to-one support that we offer, it might be that you just need a chat to answer a few questions, or at other times you might need your TSI to work more closely with you to help you through a process, like becoming a SKIO, for example. TSIs also often have various forums and networks. So at EVOC, we have forums for organizations working in mental health with children and families, as well as others. And this is a really valuable opportunity to meet other organizations at different stages in their development. So new organizations might be doing something in a different way that other organizations can learn from. And then other charities that have been around for a really long time will have skills and experience that others can learn from also. And then finally, signposting. Always get in touch, even if it's not something that if you're not sure if it's something that your TSI can help you with. Because if we can't help, we can almost always refer you to somebody who can. So I very often actually get questions about HR related issues, and I'm not an HR professional, so that's not an area that I can help with. But I will refer people to SCVO's HR service, for example. GCVS also has an HR service, or to other places, depending on the issue. So if there's one thing that I would like you to take from my few minutes here, it's, please don't feel that you ever have to kind of just muddle through when you're at different stages of your development without support. And talking to somebody early on when you're at those different stages, or if a challenge has arisen within your organization, can help that issue or that stage from becoming overwhelming to your organization. So how do you find your local TSI? There's a link there. And actually, as of a few hours ago, that link wasn't working. So I'm going to put an alternative link in the chat in just a minute, and we're on it. We know that that's not working just at the moment. So hopefully that'll be back up soon. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Christina. And yes, I would really encourage you to use your local TSI because they have a wealth of experience and knowledge in your own area. Christina mentioned bank accounts there, and I'm just conscious that I didn't mention that we have a bank account comparison table on our website. And so if you're looking for a bank, you're just starting off, or maybe you're dissatisfied with the one you've got, don't think you have to stay with them. So we've got that comparison table on the website, and that will help you see what they can offer, whether they require dual signatories, whether they have a high street presence, that kind of thing. So do check that out. I'll put the link in the chat. And now I'm going to hand over to Leanne Lodge from Gillespie McAndrew. She's the legal eagle on the panel. So if you've got any really difficult questions, Leanne's the one to direct them to. Thank you.
Thanks, I think. I've been called a lot worse than legal eagle, so hopefully you can see my screen now. Is that working? Oh, hang on, I've lost you. Okay, so can you see this now? Yeah, good, yeah. Thank you.
See both slides, Leanne. I don't know whether that...
I'm just going to go with it. We'd had this conversation before, and I didn't want to give you all a sneak preview of what was coming, but I think you can cope. I think we'll just go with it. So thank you to Tracy for inviting me along to talk today. What I'm looking to focus on is a bit of the kind of legal side of things, but with a big ton of pragmatism in it. I'm really going to give you hopefully some tips as to effectively how to cover your back when you're running a charity, what you need to record and what you don't. So the practical protections. Now, before I go into this, I'm coming at this, yes, as a lawyer, but I'm also a trustee in my own right. And actually, I've found that the boards that I'm on, sometimes we over-engineer things a little bit, and sometimes we maybe make a road for our own backs. So I'm going to give you my kind of top tips as to how to make sure you don't fall foul of any of this, but doing it at a light touch approach. So first of all, please keep good record keeping. What you're doing, but possibly more importantly, why you're doing it. And this is particularly important if it's a big decision or a decision that you think might be challenged or a little bit contentious. So, for example, I was dealing with a charity who had a lease of a building, and the lease said that every 5 years the rent should be reviewed and the charity would be responsible for paying it. Now, they could have done this, but it was likely that the rent wasn't going to go up significantly. The landlord had made an offer, and the cost that we'd got from the surveyor was £20,000 to do the review of the lease amount, which was more than the increase was going to be in any event. So we made the decision to not do the rental review increase, but actually that was all minuted as to why that decision was made and why it was in the best interests of the charity to do that. So if anybody comes back later and asks why we did it, there's a good reasoning for that. I'm also working with a charity at the minute who's done lots of You know, they're an ancient charity and they've done lots of changes over the time, but nobody can really remember why. So I'm a big fan of putting that in the deed so it doesn't get lost in memory. Steve's also already mentioned management conflicts. Again, I would encourage you all to have a conflicts policy, but be realistic when you have one. If you have an organisation that has lots of different people from the community and, you know, you've got the local head teacher, the headmaster, the vicar and all the rest of it, are you going to find somebody to make big decisions who isn't conflicted in any way? So consider whether you'll be able to, if you have an all singing, all dancing conflicts policy, is it realistic? And if it isn't, revise it. The most important thing with conflicts is to be open, to be transparent, and to record what decisions you made and why, going back to the first point. In my experience, Oscar doesn't expect you to get it right every single time, but they expect you to try to do the right thing and actually to have that evidence to say, well, in retrospect, maybe it wasn't the best decision, but it was made for all the right reasons, will give your trustees a really good standing to justify their decision. Steve's also mentioned notifiable events. I'm a big fan of these. We thought that they might come into the legislation because there is a charitable bill pending, but we don't think that that's going to be the case now, because actually it's a bit of a tester on its own. If you think that something has a significant impact on the charity and you tell Oscar about it, then that's a sign of good governance in and of itself. You know what your responsibilities are. I've been assured by Oscar, and Steve and Paula can tell me if I'm wrong, that there's not a huge red alarm that goes off when a notifiable event comes through. You know, it doesn't suddenly whir through and everybody goes, oh, quick, let's get to this charity, they've all gone wrong. It's actually a very good way of telling Oscar what's happened and why and what you're doing about it. My advice to charities is if it's a significant thing, tell Oscar. Also, and Oscar might not quite agree with me on this one, if you think somebody else is going to tell Oscar, get in there first, because isn't it a lot nicer to be able, if Oscar get a complaint from somebody and say, you know, this charity's done X, Y, and Z, if you've already gone in and said, yes, we have, but here are the reasons that we did it, this was a justification, even if it was a real problem, this is what we've done about it, and this is how we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. You're already on a good standing. Know when to take advice. There's lots of free resources out there. My experience of the resources is there's lots of good stuff, but none of it ever quite fits what you want it to do. So pick up the phone, pick up the email. There's free services there. Just be sure and cover your back and record what that advice is. And a comment that's been said already, keep your constitution under review. Mission statements, visions, aims, objectives are all brilliant, but that's not what you're legally allowed to do. And if people keep looking at their mission statement and their vision, suddenly different things can creep in with very good reason, but actually that's not what you're legally allowed to do. So take it back to the basics and keep your constitution under review. Make sure that you have enough people if it says a minimum. Make sure that you are your board is refreshing if that's what it needs to do. If your organisation is a company or a SKIO that has members, remember to consult with the members. Who are the members? I can't tell you how many people come to me 20 years later and say, actually, we've kind of not got any members. Who were they again? So keep it under review. Make sure you know what it says. And if your constitution's difficult to read and you don't understand it, get a new constitution. You can do it. You can make changes. This should be something that helps you achieve the charitable purposes. It shouldn't be something that gets in the way. And my final thing is a bit of a checklist. So as a charity trustee myself, this is what I look at if we're looking at making big decisions. Does it match the charitable purpose? Are there any regulations or legislation relevant? Is there safeguarding that you need to consider? Are there employment law, that type of thing? Does it fit within the agreed strategy? Charities and businesses in general spend an awful lot of time working out what their strategy should be, and sometimes we're a wee bit guilty of chasing the money. Now, it might be that there's good reason for that, but at least consider it and acknowledge it. What impact does it have on the budget? Can you afford it? Do you have the skills to implement it? There might be an amazing project that you want to fulfill and that you want to achieve, but actually, if you don't have the people either employed or on the board and you don't think you can get that, it's maybe not for you. And is there any private benefit? Private benefits are allowed, but it's got to be incidental to the big public benefit. So again, if there is a private benefit, that's not wrong, but just consider as a charity what it is and why you think as a board that that's okay. So that's my whistle stop shop as to how to keep yourself out of trouble, hopefully, and I'll hand back to Tracy.
Thanks, Leanne. That was good. I'm aware that we've thrown an awful lot of information at you this afternoon, and there's been lots of really useful links in the chat. So we will try and capture that in the email that we send out. We haven't had a huge amount of questions up to now. We've got 5 minutes left. So if there is anything you want to ask our panel, do shout up. I'm going to go back to a question just to Lorna and HR. It was right at the beginning, and maybe somebody might have missed that. And it was really around, you know, if you haven't employed anyone before, how do you go about paying them, you know, thinking about tax, NI, all that kind of thing. And Lorna had said, you know, you can get a payroll service, but I just wondered if you wanted to say a few words about that, Lorna, just for people that may have missed that.
Sure. Yeah, I answered the question with the suggestion that yes, you could find a payroll service. SCVO has a payroll service to do that for you. However, you can also use payroll software to do that in-house and explore kind of the different opportunities that you have there. But having a payroll software or a payroll service to do that for you will take away the complexities of calculating how everything should be each month for your employee or whoever else. You know, if you don't have an employee or if it's a freelancer, then payroll doesn't come into it because the freelancer would organize that on their own. But for making sure that everything is accurate and calculated correctly, payroll software or having the support of a payroll service is the best route to go down.
Thanks. So if they were a freelancer, Lorna, do you have, as an organisation, do you have to make it very clear from the start that that's your responsibility, you know, or is that just taken as a given?
So if there are, you know, an experienced freelancer, they would already be aware of this. However, it would be in their contract for services that we will supply you with a monthly payment agreed. It would be in the agreement that the freelancer or the contractor would provide them with an invoice of how that money, how the payment was reached, and then from there they would then deal with all of the deductions in terms of tax and national insurance. They would do that themselves, but it would be included in the contract for services.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, there's no questions coming in the chat, so that either means we've told you everything you need to know, which I'm not sure about that, or maybe you're going to ask us later on, and that's fine. You know, please do get in touch with us. So I'm just going to wrap up for now. As I said, we'll email out all the slides and links to further resources and a recording of this webinar. And just before I go, I wanted to highlight the next in the series of the life cycle of the charity webinars is looking at the trustee journey. It's bang in the middle of Trustees Week on Wednesday, the 9th of November. Same time, 1 till 2 and free. And we'll be looking there at what excellence looks like for a trustee and the key skills you need to have. We'll have somebody along from the Cranfield Trust to talk about that. And, you know, it'll be about how you develop and build skills as a trustee and what you need to know legally and practically. So as I say, I'll put the link in the chat and I'll send it out in the email. If you want to book on that, it would be great to see you there. There'll also be lots of other events going on between the 7th and 11th of November for trustees, so do look out for them. And that's it from me, really. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you found this useful. If you've got any ideas on other events that you'd like to see from SCVO, do let us know. And thanks again and good afternoon.